They had fortified 2,000 miles of European coastline with 17 million cubic yards of concrete and over 1 million tons of steel. Enough material to build the Empire State Building 270 times over. The sheer scale of construction was staggering, a monument to German organizational ability and industrial capacity. Yet this massive investment in static defense represented a fundamental strategic error, one born from lessons wrongly learned from the past. Hitler had served in the trenches of World War I, where fixed fortifications and barbed wire had stopped offensives for 4 years. He believed that properly constructed fortifications were impregnable, that concrete and steel could accomplish what flesh and blood could not. He failed to understand that the technology of 1944 was fundamentally different from 1914. That naval gunfire, strategic bombing, and the sheer weight of industrial production available to the Allies made static defense obsolete. Yet when the Allied Armada finally appeared on the horizon at dawn on June 6, 1944, the vaunted Atlantic Wall crumbled in hours, and the panzer divisions that were supposed to drive the invaders into the sea spent the day driving in circles, chasing ghosts, and arriving too late. The greatest defensive system ever constructed by German engineering failed not because it was poorly built, but because it was designed to fight a battle that would never come. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the outcome of the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The story of D-Day, from the German perspective, begins not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the mind of Adolf Hitler, who by late 1943 found himself commanding a Wehrmacht, stretched across 3 continents and bleeding from 1,000 cuts. In his Führer Directive No. 51, issued on November 3, 1943, Hitler warned his commanders of consequences of staggering proportions if the Western Allies gained a foothold in France. The language was apocalyptic because the strategic reality was dire. Germany's Luftwaffe had withdrawn nearly all fighters from France to counter American daylight bombing raids over the Reich itself. The Kriegsmarine, once the terror of the Atlantic, had seen its surface fleet hounded to destruction or bottled up in Norwegian fjords, while its U-boats faced an almost impossible task penetrating the belt of Allied naval and air defenses. The defense of Fortress Europe would fall squarely on the shoulders of an army already hemorrhaging. Divisions in Russia. France had become what military planners call a reconstitution zone, a place where divisions burned out on the Eastern Front were sent to recuperate. The reality of this reconstitution varied wildly between units. A panzer division arriving from Russia might have its tanks replaced and its ranks filled with fresh recruits, transforming it back into an effective fighting force within months. An infantry division arriving with 20% of its original strength might receive enough men to appear full on paper. But those men were often poorly trained replacements, old soldiers pulled from training schools, or conscripts from occupied territories with minimal German language skills and questionable loyalty. The armament industry that supplied these divisions was itself under siege. Allied strategic bombing, particularly the American daylight raids that intensified throughout 1944, struck at the factories producing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. The attacks on synthetic oil plants were especially devastating. Germany, lacking natural petroleum reserves, relied on coal liquefaction plants to produce fuel. By mid-1944, these plants were priority targets. The cumulative effect was a fuel crisis that crippled training and operations. Luftwaffe pilots flew fewer and fewer hours in training, arriving at combat units with inadequate skills. Panzer crews conducted exercises without fuel, learning vehicle operation while the tanks were towed by trucks. The German war machine was literally running dry even before D-Day. The coastline was held by a thin line of garrison troops from which the fittest and most able had been combed out to feed the meat grinder in the east. These were not the soldiers who had blitzed across Poland and France in 1940. These were older men, boys too young for the Eastern Front, men recovering from wounds, and entire battalions of Osttroppen, former Soviet prisoners of war who had traded certain death in German camps for uncertain death in German uniform. They manned the concrete bunkers and gun emplacements of the Atlantic Wall with dubious loyalty and even more dubious combat effectiveness. Yet Hitler insisted they would be enough, because Hitler had never lost faith in the power of fixed fortifications. The Atlantic Wall itself was part fortress, part propaganda fiction. Construction had begun in 1942, a response to the disastrous British-Canadian raid on Dieppe that year, which ironically convinced Hitler that amphibious assaults could be defeated on the beaches if the defenses were strong enough. The Germans poured resources into the project, building 15,000 concrete structures from Norway to Spain, ranging from massive gun batteries capable of firing across the English Channel to small pillboxes designed for a single machine gun crew. The fortifications were most complete in the Pas-de-Calais, the obvious invasion point, where the channel narrowed to just 21 miles. This concentration of defenses in the wrong place was not merely bad luck, but the result of successful Allied deception and German preconceptions about how the war would be fought. German generals, trained in classical military doctrine, understood that the shortest distance between 2 points made the most sense logistically. Invading at Calais meant shorter sea voyages, quicker reinforcement, and direct routes to the Rhine and the heart of Germany. It made perfect sense, which is exactly why the Allies planned to land in Normandy instead. The construction of Atlantic Wall fortifications employed a workforce that included German military engineers, organization-taught construction battalions, contracted firms from Germany and occupied countries, and hundreds of thousands of forced laborers. These forced laborers included prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and civilians conscripted from occupied territories. They worked in brutal conditions, often malnourished, inadequately housed, and driven by guards who had quotas to meet. The concrete bunkers of the Atlantic Wall were built with slave labor, and the men who built them often died in the process. This moral stain on the Atlantic Wall is rarely discussed in purely military analyses, but it cannot be separated from the structure itself. Every fortification was built on suffering. There, the defenses formed something like a continuous belt. Elsewhere, the wall was more concept than reality. Strong points separated by miles of lightly defended beachfront into this precarious situation arrived. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in November 1943. Appointed by Hitler as commander of Army Group B, and given the task of inspecting coastal defenses from the Netherlands to the Loire, what Rommel found appalled him. The desert fox, who had learned in North Africa what Allied air superiority meant for ground operations, understood immediately that the Atlantic Wall was fatally incomplete. He threw himself into a frenzy of construction, adding pillboxes, gun emplacements, and millions of mines. He ordered the placement of beach obstacles by the thousands, a diabolic garden of steel and concrete designed to impale landing craft at high tide. There were hembalkens, heavy wooden obstacles tipped with mines. There were element sea gates, steel frames that resembled oversized sawhorses. There were Belgian gates, rollers made of steel girders designed to crush boats. And most iconic of all, there were Czech hedgehogs, six-pointed steel stars forged from railway rails, each one weighing over 1,000 pounds and capable of tearing the bottom out of any landing craft that struck it. Rommel's energy was legendary. He personally inspected construction sites, harangued engineers, and drove his staff to exhaustion. He extended defenses inland to cover glider landing zones, a prescient move that would later frustrate Allied airborne operations. He had asparagus fields planted, not the vegetable, but thousands of wooden poles sunk into French fields to prevent glider landings. He laid over 6 million mines, though he wanted 50 million. In some sectors, the defenses improved dramatically. But time was not on Rommel's side. By May 1944, he wrote to his wife that if the British would just give him 2 more weeks, he would have no doubt about defeating them. The British did not give him 2 weeks. Rommel's defensive philosophy was shaped by his experience in North Africa, where he had learned that defensive positions must be deep, must include multiple fallback lines, and must never be allowed to become static. His experience at El Alamein, where British artillery and air power had ground down his Afrika Korps, taught him that defending against an enemy with material superiority required constant movement and counterattack. But Normandy was not North Africa. The terrain was different, the mission was different, and most critically, Hitler's command philosophy would not permit the flexible defense that Rommel knew was necessary. Yet even as Rommel fortified the coast, a deeper strategic paralysis gripped the German high command. The question was not whether the Allies would invade, but where, and more critically, how to respond when they did. This question produced a bitter disagreement between Rommel and Field Marshal Georg von Rundstedt, the overall commander-in-chief West, that would doom the German defense before a single Allied soldier set foot on French soil. The personalities of the German commanders shaped the disaster as much as their strategies. Rundstedt, at 68 years old in 1944, was a product of the Imperial German Army. A man who had learned his trade in the trenches of the First World War and refined it through the campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. He was a military aristocrat, correct in manner, conservative in method, and deeply skeptical of National Socialism, though outwardly loyal. He viewed the Nazi Party leadership with barely concealed contempt and Hitler's military interventions as the meddling of a dilettante. Yet he served because he had sworn an oath and because, like most of the old officer corps, he believed that professional soldiers served the state regardless of regime. Rommel, by contrast, was a Nazi true believer, or at least had been for most of the war. He was a commoner who had risen through ability and Hitler's favor, commander of the Führer's headquarters guard in the Polish campaign, then thrust into command of a panzer division in France, where he earned fame as a daring and aggressive commander. His reputation was built on the North African campaign, where propaganda had transformed him into the legendary Desert Fox. By 1944, however, Rommel's faith in Hitler was beginning to crack. He had seen the Führer's strategic mistakes, witnessed the waste of German lives in futile offensives, and understood that Germany was losing the war. He would eventually join the conspiracy to overthrow Hitler, a decision that would cost him his life. Rundstedt was old-school Prussian, a practitioner of classical defensive doctrine. He believed the Atlantic Wall, no matter how much Rommel improved it, could not stop a determined amphibious assault backed by overwhelming naval gunfire. His solution was to allow the Allies to land, absorb their initial punch with coastal infantry divisions, and then unleash a massive armored counterattack once the enemy was committed and exposed. To execute this strategy, Rundstedt wanted the 10 panzer divisions in France held far back from the coast, concentrated near Paris, where they could strike in force at any invasion sector once Allied intentions became clear. It was sound doctrine, the kind of mobile defense the Wehrmacht had practiced since 1941. Rommel disagreed violently. He had seen what Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, did to armored columns in daylight. Moving panzer divisions dozens of miles to the coast under Allied air supremacy was suicide. The tanks would be destroyed in transit, blown apart on French roads before they ever engaged the enemy. Rommel's solution was radical. Place the panzers right on the coast, as close to the beaches as possible. Hit the Allies in the water in the first hours, before they could establish a foothold. Win or lose the battle on the beaches in the first day. It was a strategy born from experience, from having watched British Typhoons turn his Africa Corps tanks into burning wrecks. The disagreement went all the way to Hitler, who characteristically chose the worst possible compromise. He gave Rommel direct control of 3 panzer divisions, but only one, the 21st Panzer Division, was positioned near the Normandy coast. 2 others, the 2nd and 116th Panzer, were held north of the Seine, far enough away to be useless on D-Day. 3 more divisions went to Army Group G in southern France, too far away to matter. The remaining 4 divisions, including the elite SS formations like the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and Panzerlehr, stayed in a central reserve under direct control of Wehrmacht's Supreme Headquarters. They could not be moved without Hitler's express permission. The Führer, in his infinite strategic wisdom, had created a system where the only man who could order the tanks to move was asleep at the critical moment. By early June 1944, the German order of battle in France totaled 58 divisions, a formidable number on paper, but the reality was grimmer. Of these, only 15 were full-strength field divisions with transport and combat experience. The rest were static divisions, immobile and leavened with Osterpen of uncertain reliability. The Normandy coast itself, from the Cotentin Peninsula to Cannes, was held by 7 divisions. The 709th and 243rd Static Divisions held the Cotentin. The 352nd Infantry Division, a veteran unit recently moved to the coast and undetected by Allied intelligence, held the sector that included Omaha Beach. The 716th Static Division held the beaches designated Gold, Juno, and Sword. These units would bear the full weight of the Allied assault. The men in those divisions knew an invasion was coming. German intelligence had tracked the Allied buildup in southern England throughout the spring. Reconnaissance aircraft, on the rare occasions they penetrated Allied air defenses, photographed massive concentrations of landing craft. Coastal radar stations picked up increased naval activity. But German intelligence, compromised by Allied deception operations and strangled by Hitler's paranoia, could not determine when or where the blow would fall. Most German commanders, including Rundstedt, believed the invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. It was the shortest route across the Channel, the most direct path to the heart of Germany. Allied deception operations, collectively known as Operation Fortitude, reinforced this belief with fake radio traffic, dummy divisions, and inflatable tanks. The Allies even created an entire Phantom Army group in southeast England under General George Patton, the American commander the Germans feared most. Fortitude was so successful that even after D-Day, German high command remained convinced Normandy was a feint and the real invasion would still come at Calais. The German intelligence failure regarding D-Day was comprehensive and catastrophic. The Wehrmacht's Abwehr, its military intelligence service, had been compromised by Allied counterintelligence operations to an extent that would not be fully understood until after the war. Every German agent in Britain had been either captured and turned or was a double agent from the beginning. The intelligence reports flowing back to Germany were carefully crafted by British intelligence services to support the Fortitude deception. When the Abwehr reported massive troop concentrations in southeast England under Patton's command, those reports were accurate in describing what German reconnaissance observed, but completely false in terms of what they meant. The troops were inflatable, the tanks were plywood, the radio traffic was scripted. German intelligence was not merely fooled, but actively manipulated. Fed information that seemed credible because it came from sources they trusted. The signals intelligence picture was equally bleak for Germany. The Allies had broken German codes, most famously the Enigma machine cipher, allowing them to read Wehrmacht communications in near real time. The Germans suspected their codes were compromised, but convinced themselves that the mathematical complexity of Enigma made it unbreakable. They could not imagine that the Allies had industrial facilities dedicated to breaking codes. machines designed by brilliant mathematicians, and captured Enigma machines and codebooks from U-boats and other sources. German commanders planning the defense of France were operating in a fog of war while their enemies could see clearly. The weather in early June was abysmal. Storms lashed the channel, creating conditions that German meteorologists deemed impossible for amphibious operations. Rommel himself, convinced the Allies could not possibly invade in such weather, left France on June 4th to visit his wife in Germany for her birthday. Other commanders relaxed their guard. On the evening of June 5th, many senior officers were away from their posts, attending a war game exercise in Rennes, designed ironically to practice responses to an Allied invasion. When the storm broke briefly on the night of June 5th, creating a narrow window of marginally acceptable weather, the Germans were caught completely off guard. The first indication that something was wrong came just after midnight on June 6th, when reports flooded in of massive Allied airborne drops across Normandy. Paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were landing in the Cotentin Peninsula, while British 6th Airborne Division dropped east of Caen. But the reports were confused and contradictory. Some units reported airdrops that were actually dummy paratroopers, life-size dolls dropped with firecrackers to simulate gunfire. Other reports came from nervous sentry-seeing shadows. General Erich Marx, commanding 84 Corps, tried to sort through the chaos. He ordered the 91st Air Landing Division to clear paratroopers south of Corentin. He called for reinforcements. But in the dark, without air reconnaissance, without reliable communications, Marx was operating blind. Then dawn came, and with it an armada that defied comprehension. The experience of ordinary German soldiers in the hours before the invasion varied wildly depending on their position and unit. Some bunkers along the coast had radar sets that detected the approaching Allied fleet hours before dawn, giving defenders time to man positions and prepare for bombardment. Other positions had no warning at all until the naval guns opened fire. Communication systems, already stressed by the airborne drops and Allied bombing of telephone exchanges, broke down in the opening hours of the invasion. Many bunkers found themselves isolated, unable to contact higher headquarters, forced to fight on their own initiative without knowing the scope of the invasion or what forces were coming against them. In some positions, German defenders had prepared for this moment for months, conducting drills, pre-registering artillery on approach routes, and establishing fallback positions. These units, particularly the veteran 352nd Division at Omaha, performed with lethal efficiency. In other positions, defenders were taken completely by surprise, caught in their bunkers without ammunition readily accessible, machine guns not mounted, defensive positions not fully manned. The 716th Static Division, holding the beaches from Arromanches to Weistrum, included a significant number of Osttroppen who had no love for Germany and no reason to die for the Third Reich. Some of these units fought bravely regardless. Others surrendered at the first opportunity. Still others simply fled when the bombardment became unbearable. German coastal observers, stumbling from their bunkers at first light, saw the horizon black with ships. Over 5,000 vessels, from battleships to landing craft, stretched as far as the eye could see. Naval guns opened fire, shells the size of automobiles screaming overhead to explode among the German positions. Allied bombers carpeted the beaches with explosives. The defenders hunkered in their bunkers, waiting for the bombardment to lift, knowing that when it did, the infantry would come at 5 coastal sectors. The landing craft hit the beaches between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. at Utah Beach on the Cotentin's eastern shore. The American 4th Infantry Division landed in the wrong place, a fortunate accident that put them ashore against lighter defenses. At Gold and Sword beaches, British infantry supported by specialized armor breached the Atlantic Wall within hours. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces took heavy casualties but fought inland. But at Omaha Beach, the German 352nd Infantry Division, positioned in the most defensible terrain on the entire Normandy coast, nearly threw the Americans back into the sea. Omaha Beach was a killing ground by design. A crescent of sand backed by steep bluffs, it offered no cover and no easy routes inland. The Germans had fortified the heights with interlocking fields of fire, concrete bunkers, and steel. One strong point in particular, Wider Stansness 62, dominated the eastern half of the beach. Manning the MG-42 machine gun and WN-62 was a 20-year-old soldier named Heinrich Sevelo. When the American landing craft hit the beach at 6:30 a.m., Sevelo opened fire. The MG-42 was a weapon of extraordinary lethality, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute. So fast, its sound was not the tat-tat-tat of other machine guns, but a continuous ripping roar that Allied troops called "hit their zipper." Severo fired for 9 hours that morning. He went through 12,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition and 400 rounds from a semi-automatic rifle. The Americans came ashore in waves, and each wave was cut down by the defenders. Bodies piled up at the waterline. Wounded men drowned in the incoming tide. Young soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat, huddled behind beach obstacles and burned-out vehicles, paralyzed by fear and fire. The German defensive fire plan at Omaha Beach was a masterpiece of interlocking fields of fire and pre-positioned artillery. The 352nd Division's artillery commander had spent months surveying the beach, plotting every approach, calculating firing tables for various tide conditions. When the American landing craft appeared, German artillery observers radioed coordinates to batteries positioned inland, beyond the reach of naval guns. High explosive shells bracketed the beach, airbursting over the exposed Americans. Mortar fire, directed from the bluffs, dropped into concentrations of troops. Machine gun fire from the WN strongpoints that dotted the heights swept the beach in overlapping cones that left no dead space, no safe zone. The German soldiers manning these positions were not supermen. Many were terrified by the naval bombardment, deafened by the explosions, concussed by near misses. But their training held. They had rehearsed this moment, practiced firing at designated points on the beach, learned to reload in the dark, and clear jammed weapons by feel. The MG-42 machine gun, firing from a fixed position with ammunition brought forward in advance, was a supremely effective weapon. Its rate of fire meant that even poorly aimed bursts would hit something in the densely packed American formations below. The concrete bunkers absorbed punishment that would have destroyed open positions. Naval shells that hit directly might penetrate, but most burst against the reinforced concrete without breaching it. For a few hours, it appeared the Atlantic Wall might actually work. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces from the cruiser USS Offshore, received reports so catastrophic he considered evacuating Omaha Beach entirely. German defenders, firing from positions that had survived the Allied bombardment, inflicted casualties at a rate that threatened to turn the landing into a massacre. But the defenders had no way to exploit their success. They had no reserves, no tanks, no counterattacking force. They could kill Americans, and they did, 2,400 on Omaha alone that day. But they could not drive them off the beach that by mid-morning, small groups of Americans, led by sergeants and lieutenants who decided that dying on the beach was no better than dying on the bluffs, began working their way up the draws and gullies. Engineers blasted paths through obstacles. Destroyers, risking their hulls, moved in close to shore to provide direct fire support. Slowly, agonizingly, the Americans gained the heights. By afternoon, they were pushing inland. Severo, His ammunition finally exhausted, retreated from WW2. The strongpoint fell. The Americans secured a toehold. The German response to the landings was a masterclass in confusion. Rommel was in Germany. Hitler was asleep at his residence in Berchtesgaden and had left orders not to be disturbed. His staff, terrified of waking the Führer, delayed for hours before informing him of the invasion. When Hitler finally woke at noon, he initially dismissed Normandy as a diversion. The Panzer Reserve divisions, which Rundstedt desperately wanted to commit to battle, could not move without Hitler's authorization. That authorization did not come until afternoon, by which time the Allies had 6 hours to consolidate their beachheads. The German command structure on D-Day was a dysfunctional hierarchy where authority and responsibility were mismatched at every level. Battalion commanders on the ground understood the situation but lacked authority to commit reserves. Regimental commanders could see the scope of the invasion but could not move units without division approval. Division commanders needed corps approval. Corps commanders needed army approval. And at the top of this chain, decisions that should have taken minutes took hours because Hitler, 700 miles away in Berchtesgaden, had reserved to himself the authority to commit the Panzer. This centralization of command was characteristic of Nazi Germany's entire war effort. Hitler, convinced of his own military genius after the successes of 1939 and 1940, increasingly micromanaged operations at every level. By 1944, he was personally approving tactical movements that should have been left to company commanders. His generals, cowed by purges and fearful of his rages, hesitated to act without explicit approval. The result was an army that could not react at the speed of battle, that fought at a tempo dictated by the time required to get authorization from a man sleeping in Bavaria. The paralysis extended down through the ranks. Junior officers, trained to follow orders rather than take initiative, waited for direction that often never came. NCOs, the backbone of any army, found themselves making decisions that should have come from above simply because there was no alternative. Some units functioned well under this chaos because their leader signaled proper procedure and acted on their own judgment. Other units disintegrated because their leaders waited for orders until it was too late. Only one German armored unit was close enough to counterattack on D-Day. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed southeast of Cannes under General Edgar Feutinger, had spent the night fighting confused skirmishes with British paratroopers. When dawn broke and the scope of the invasion became clear, General Marx ordered Feutinger to attack immediately toward the coast. But Feutinger needed authorization from Rommel's headquarters, and Rommel was not there. It took hours of radio messages with Rommel's chief of staff, Colonel Hans Speidel, before Marx finally got control of the division at noon. Even then, moving the 21st Panzer proved nightmarish. The division had to cross the Orne River, wheel through the city of Cannes, and drive north to the sea. Every bridge was choked with refugees and retreating infantry. Allied fighter bombers swarmed overhead like hornets, attacking anything that moved. The division took 3 hours to cover 10 miles. Not until 4:20 p.m. did the counterattack finally begin. Leading the assault was Colonel Hermann Oppeln-Bronichowski, a legendary panzer commander known for his swagger and seemingly charmed life. He had survived direct hits on his tank 3 times and walked away each time without a scratch. His 22nd Panzer Regiment rolled north toward Perrier's Ridge with confidence. Mark IV tanks in the lead, Panzer Grenadiers following on half tracks. It looked like the kind of combined arms attack the Wehrmacht had perfected in 5 years of war. Then they hit the British. The Shropshire Light Infantry, dug in on Perrier's Ridge, had spent the morning preparing their positions. They had 6-pounder anti-tank guns, Firefly tanks mounting high-velocity 17-pounder guns, and self-propelled artillery. They held their fire until the German tanks reached the base of the ridge, then opened up with everything. 6 Mark IVs exploded in the first minutes. 9 more followed. The surviving German tanks scattered for cover. Opelm's luck had run out. His regiment had been stopped cold. On the left flank of the attack, elements of the 192nd Panzergrenadier Regiment had better fortune. They hit the seam between British and Canadian forces and, meeting little resistance, drove all the way to the coast at Lyon-sur-Mer. They had reached the sea. They had split the Allied beachhead. For a moment, it seemed like a triumph, but it was an empty victory. The Panzergrenadiers were now trapped in a narrow salient between two powerful Allied forces pouring fire into them from both sides. Any attempt to exploit the penetration would have required marching along the beach in full view of Allied naval guns. The battleships and cruisers offshore would have had a shooting gallery. At 9 p.m., as daylight faded, General Feuchtinger looked up and saw the sky filled with aircraft. The British were launching a massive glider reinforcement of their airborne bridgehead east of the Orne. 250 gliders escorted by fighters. Fearing an airborne landing in his rear, Feuchtinger ordered the Panzergrenadiers to retreat. The counterattack was over. The 21st Panzer had lost 70 tanks and gained nothing. Elsewhere, the German response was no better. Kampfrupp-Meyer, a battle group built around the 915th Regiment, spent D-Day driving back and forth across Normandy, chasing false reports of paratroop landings, receiving contradictory orders, and ultimately accomplishing nothing. The unit's commander, Colonel Meyer, was killed by British tanks before his force ever engaged the enemy. The 716th Static Division, defending the beaches against the British, was shattered by noon. The 709th and 243rd Divisions in the Cotentin were overrun or isolated. Only the 352nd Division at Omaha could claim any success, and even that was Pyrrhic. The Americans were ashore. The Atlantic Wall had been breached at 5 points. And the Panzers, the only force capable of driving the Allies back into the sea, were still sitting near Paris, waiting for permission to move by nightfall on June 6th. The strategic situation was already beyond salvage, though the Germans did not yet realize it. The Allies had landed 156,000 men at a cost of 10,000 casualties. The Germans had suffered between 4,000 and 9,000 casualties, but more critically, they had lost the only opportunity to defeat the invasion at the waterline. Once the Allies were ashore in force, with air superiority and overwhelming firepower, the outcome was inevitable. It would take time, and it would cost lives. But the Germans had no way to win. The tactical performance of German units in the days following D-Day revealed the continuing competence of the Wehrmacht at small unit level, even as strategic and operational command collapsed. German squad and platoon leaders excelled at defensive tactics, using terrain to maximum advantage, establishing fields of fire, and coordinating between infantry and supporting weapons. The German infantry squad, built around the MG-42 machine gun, with riflemen providing security and ammunition supply for the gun, was a more effective defensive unit than its American equivalent. The MG-42's rate of fire gave each squad firepower equivalent to multiple Allied squads. German defensive tactics emphasized the immediate counterattack to recapture lost positions before the enemy could consolidate. This doctrine, drilled into every soldier from basic training, meant that any Allied unit capturing a position could expect a German counterattack within hours, often within minutes. These counterattacks were conducted by small groups, sometimes just a squad or platoon, using infiltration tactics to approach undercover and assault with grenades and automatic weapons at close range. The tactics were effective but costly, requiring exactly the kind of aggressive small unit leadership that was becoming scarce as casualties mounted. The integration of anti-tank defenses into the German defensive system was sophisticated and deadly. Every German infantry battalion had an anti-tank platoon equipped with towed 75mm guns or self-propelled tank destroyers. These weapons were positioned in depth, with forward positions sacrificed to draw in the Allied armor and rear positions positioned to fire on the flanks of penetrating tanks. German crews would allow the first tanks to pass, then engage the following vehicles, creating chaos and blocking retreat. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun, when used in the anti-tank role, could destroy any Allied tank at ranges up to 2 kilometers, well beyond the effective range of most Allied tank guns. The days following D-Day saw the Germans fight with the ferocious skill that had made the Wehrmacht legendary. The 12th S Hitlerjugend Division, composed of teenage fanatics who had known nothing but Nazi indoctrination, arrived on June 7th and immediately launched savage counterattacks against Canadian forces. These boys, many only 17 or 18 years old, fought with suicidal courage, staging attack after attack that gained nothing but inflicted horrific casualties on both sides. The Canadians held, but at a cost that left entire battalions shattered. Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of the finest armored formations in the German army, moved toward Normandy on June 7th and 8th, enduring constant air attacks that destroyed dozens of vehicles before the division ever reached the front. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later described the march as a journey through hell, with fighter bombers attacking every hour, reducing his magnificent division to a shadow of itself. When Panzer Lehr finally entered battle west of Caen, it fought brilliantly, stopping British attempts to outflank the city. But it was never strong enough to do more than defend. The German defense of Normandy became a slow death by attrition. Every day, Allied artillery and naval guns pounded German positions. Every night, Allied bombers struck supply lines and reinforcements. The Germans could replace neither men nor equipment. Tanks destroyed in battle stayed destroyed. Infantry battalions reduced to company strength stayed reduced. Meanwhile, the Allies built up their forces faster than the Germans could contain them. By mid-June, over 300,000 Allied troops were ashore, supported by tanks, artillery, and an air force that owned the sky. Hitler, true to form, forbade any retreat. Every village was to be held to the last man. Every counterattack was to drive to the sea. His orders were operationally insane and strategically catastrophic. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and Rommel both pleaded for permission to conduct a mobile defense, to trade space for time, to withdraw to the Seine where a defensive line might be held. Hitler refused. Von Rundstedt was sacked. Rommel, on July 17th, was strafed by British fires and critically wounded, his skull fractured, his career over. He would later be implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler and forced to take poison. The two best commanders Germany had in the West were removed from the battlefield by their own side. The German air defense system in Normandy was virtually non-existent. Another consequence of the strategic decision to prioritize defense of the Reich over France. The few Luftwaffe fighters that appeared over the battlefield were overwhelmed by Allied numbers. German anti-aircraft units, equipped with 88mm guns and lighter automatic weapons, could engage low-flying aircraft but could not contest Allied air superiority. The psychological effect of constant air attack on German troops was devastating. Soldiers learned to freeze at the sound of aircraft engines, knowing that movement drew fire. Daytime troop movements became almost impossible. Supply columns moved only at night, navigating by moonlight or with headlights off. The Allied air supremacy also meant that German reconnaissance was nearly blind. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft attempting to photograph Allied dispositions were routinely shot down. German commanders planning operations had only fragmentary information about enemy positions. often relying on ground observation or reports from frontline units. In contrast, Allied commanders had aerial photographs updated daily, showing German positions in detail. This intelligence asymmetry gave the Allies an operational advantage that compounded their material superiority. The end, when it came, was swift. On July 25th, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout from their lodgment area in the Cotentin. The attack was preceded by carpet bombing so intense it obliterated the Panzer Lehr Division, literally erasing battalions from existence. American armored columns, led by General George Patton's Third Army, poured through the breach and raced across France. The Germans, still fixated on defending Caen and still convinced that a second invasion would come at Calais, had no reserves to stop them. Hitler, in his last great act of strategic folly, ordered a counterattack at Mortain on August 7th, an attempt to cut off the American breakthrough. The attack failed utterly, and in failing, doomed the entire German force in Normandy to fighting in the Bocage. Country of Normandy revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the German defensive system. Bocage is a landscape unique to Normandy, characterized by small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows on raised earthen banks, sometimes topped with trees. These hedgerows, centuries old, were thick enough to stop a tank and tall enough to limit visibility to a few dozen yards. For defenders, the Bocage was ideal terrain. Every field was a miniature fortress. Every hedgerow concealed machine gun nests and anti-tank guns. German defenders could hear Allied tanks approaching long before they could see them and could destroy vehicles before the crews even knew they were under fire. The Germans exploited this terrain with masterful skill. Small battle groups, sometimes no larger than a reinforced platoon, could hold up entire American battalions for days. The defenders would ambush the lead tank, blocking the narrow lanes, then retreat to the next hedgerow before American artillery could respond. These delaying actions were conducted by men who knew they were fighting a lost cause but fought anyway, following orders, following training, or simply following the primal imperative to survive another day. The Americans called this the Battle of the Hedgerows, and it cost them 29,000 casualties in June and July. But the Bocage that protected German infantry also trapped German armor. Panzer divisions, designed for mobile warfare across open terrain, found themselves confined to narrow lanes where a single disabled tank could block an entire column. The thick vegetation prevented observation, making coordinated attacks nearly impossible. Tank commanders who were used to seeing the battlefield from the cupola of their vehicles found themselves blind, navigating by map and instinct through a labyrinth where every turn might lead to an ambush. The 2nd Panzer Division, attempting to move from the British sector to block American breakout attempts in July, spent 3 days covering 15 miles through the Bocage, harassed constantly by air attacks and ambushes. German defensive doctrine in Normandy relied heavily on immediate counterattacks to recapture lost ground. This was sound tactics in theory. When Allied forces captured a village or position, they needed time to consolidate, bring up supplies, and establish defensive positions. A German counterattack launched within hours, before the enemy was set, could often recapture ground with minimal casualties. The problem was that by June 1944, the Germans lacked the resources to conduct effective counterattacks. Artillery support was limited by ammunition shortages. Tank support was often unavailable, and any concentration of troops for counterattack drew immediate attention from Allied fighter-bombers. Yet the counterattacks came anyway. Wave after wave, launched on orders from commanders who insisted that lost ground must be retaken regardless of cost. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division launched 43 separate counterattacks in the 3 weeks following D-Day. Almost all of them failures, almost all of them costly. These attacks were conducted by teenagers who had been raised from childhood to believe in Nazi ideology, who fought with fanatical determination, and who died in shocking numbers. By the end of June, the division had lost over 60% of its infantry and half its tanks. It remained combat effective only because German units were trained to function even when heavily depleted, reorganizing into ad hoc battle groups that combined survivors from multiple shattered battalions. The Allies, recognizing the opportunity, launched operations to encircle the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army in a pocket near Falaise. The Germans fought desperately to escape, and many did, abandoning all their heavy equipment and vehicles. But when the pocket finally closed on August 22nd, 50,000 German soldiers were captured and 10,000 lay dead. The roads of Normandy were littered with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and the wreckage of an army. In total, the Germans suffered 290,000 casualties in Normandy, 23,000 dead, 67,000 wounded, and 200,000 missing or captured. 25 of 38 divisions in the theater were destroyed outright. The rest were reduced to shattered remnants. German armor, which had begun the campaign with 2,000 tanks, ended with 70 operational vehicles split among all surviving panzer divisions. The loss was not just tactical or operational. It was existential. The Wehrmacht would never recover. The material reality of the German defensive position reveals why courage alone could never be enough. A German infantry division in Normandy in 1944 averaged 12,000 men, down from the 17,000 that had been standard earlier in the war. These divisions had 66 artillery pieces, compared to 72 for an American division. But the Americans had nearly unlimited ammunition, while German gunners rationed every shell. A German panzer division fielded between 120 and 150 tanks, but fuel was so scarce that training exercises were often conducted with horses pulling the tanks. The mechanical readiness rate for German armor in France hovered around 70%, meaning that nearly a third of tanks were not operational at any given time. Due to lack of spare parts, the logistics situation was catastrophic and worsening daily. German supply lines ran through France on a railway system that Allied bombers had systematically destroyed over the previous months. Trains that once covered the journey from Germany to Normandy in 2 days now took 2 weeks, if they arrived at all. Trucks were in such short supply that some infantry divisions relied on horse-drawn wagons for transport, just as their grandfathers had in 1914, when the 2nd SS, Das Reich Division, moved from southern France to Normandy in June. It took 18 days to cover a distance that should have required 3, delayed constantly by sabotage from French resistance fighters and airstrikes from Allied fighter bombers. By the time the division arrived, it had lost a quarter of its vehicles and much of its combat effectiveness. The German soldier in Normandy fought with a skill and determination that earned the grudging respect of Allied commanders. He held ground that could not be held. He launched counterattacks that could not succeed. He defended against an enemy that had more of everything: more tanks, more planes, more guns, more men, more time. The German soldier did his duty, and it was not enough that the human cost of the German defense is measured not just in casualties, but in the destruction of military professionalism that had been the Wehrmacht's defining characteristic. The officer corps that planned the 1940 campaign in France, that drove across Russia in 1941, that conducted brilliant retreats in North Africa, was by 1944 depleted by attrition and corrupted by ideology. Hitler's purges following the July 20th assassination attempt would remove many of the remaining professionals, replacing them with Nazi loyalists whose primary qualification was political reliability rather than military competence. The Normandy campaign marked the end of the Wehrmacht as a professional military force and the beginning of its transformation into a fanatical instrument of a dying regime. The experience of ordinary German soldiers in Normandy reveals the psychological cost of fighting a hopeless battle. Letters and diaries recovered after the war describe men who understood intellectually that Germany was losing but clung to hopes of miracle weapons, new alliances, or divine intervention that would somehow reverse the tide. Propaganda spoke of vengeance weapons, the V1 and V2 rockets that were falling on London, suggesting these would break British will to fight. Soldiers heard rumors of jet aircraft that would sweep Allied bombers from the skies, of new U-boats that would cut the Atlantic supply line, of secret negotiations with the Western Allies to turn against the Soviet Union. These fantasies sustained morale even as the evidence of defeat accumulated. Medical records from German hospitals in France show the physical toll of the campaign. Combat stress, what later wars would call post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested in epidemic levels. Soldiers developed psychosomatic symptoms, paralysis, blindness, muteness, all without physical injury. These were not cowards or malingerers, but men whose minds had broken under the strain of constant bombardment, of seeing friends killed, of knowing that every day might be their last. German military medical officers, trained in a harsh tradition that viewed such symptoms as weakness, often sent these men back to the front with minimal treatment, adding to the overall collapse of unit cohesion. The question of war crimes cannot be ignored when examining the German defense of Normandy. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, in particular, was implicated in the murder of Canadian prisoners at the Ardennes Abbey on June 7th and 8th, where over 40 Allied posts were executed in cold blood. These killings were not isolated incidents, but part of a pattern of behavior by SS units that viewed the war as a racial struggle rather than a conventional military conflict. The division's commander, Kurt Meyer, would be tried and convicted after the war for these crimes. The atrocities committed during the Normandy campaign serve as a reminder that the German soldiers, whatever their individual motivations, were serving a regime whose fundamental nature was criminal. The failure at Normandy was not for lack of courage or tactical skill. It was a failure of strategy, a failure of command, and above all, a failure of Nazi Germany's entire system of war-making. Hitler's refusal to trust his commanders, his insistence on controlling every decision, his delusion that willpower could substitute for resources, all combined to create a defensive plan that was doomed from inception. Rommel and Rundstedt disagreed on how to fight, but Hitler's compromise satisfied neither and created a system where the reserves could not move without permission from a man who was asleep. The Atlantic Wall, that triumph of German engineering, was always a facade. It was strong where the Allies did not land and weak where they did. It consumed resources that might have been used to build mobile reserves. It encouraged a defensive mindset that was psychologically comforting but operationally fatal. Fixed fortifications, no matter how strong, cannot stop a determined enemy with overwhelming force. They can only delay. The panzer divisions, the true striking power of the German defense, were hobbled by strategic paralysis and Allied air superiority. Held too far back to intervene on D-Day, they arrived piecemeal in the days following, just in time to be destroyed in detail by an enemy that had already achieved critical mass. The German response to D-Day was not a response at all. It was a slow-motion collapse, a series of tactical victories that added up to strategic catastrophe. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan, deserves recognition as one of the most successful strategic ruses in military history. By convincing Hitler and his high command that Normandy was a feint, that the real invasion would come at Calais, Fortitude kept German reserves frozen in place for weeks after D-Day. The Phantom Army under Patton, the fake radio traffic, the turned agents feeding false information to German intelligence, all combined to paralyze German decision-making at the critical moment. The Germans were not just fighting the Allies in Normandy. They were fighting ghosts in Calais, and the ghosts won. The question of whether any German strategy could have defeated the D-Day invasion is ultimately academic. By June 1944, Germany was fighting the combined industrial might of the United States, Britain, Canada, and what remained of the free world. The Allies had cracked German codes, dominated the seas and skies, and assembled an invasion force that dwarfed anything Germany could field in the West. Even if Rommel had placed all the panzers on the coast, even if Hitler had released them immediately, even if the Atlantic Wall had been complete, the Allies would have landed somewhere. They would have adjusted their plans, concentrated their forces, and broken through. The only question was where and when. What the Germans could have done, perhaps, was make the cost high enough and the progress slow enough that political will in Britain and America might have wavered. If Omaha Beach had failed entirely, if the panzers had driven to the coast on D-Day, if the Allies had been thrown back with catastrophic losses, it is conceivable that the invasion might have been delayed for months. But delayed is not defeated. The Allies would have returned with more men, more ships, more bombs. The outcome was never in doubt. The only question was how long it would take and how many would die. The German soldiers who defended Normandy did not have the luxury of strategic hindsight. They fought with the weapons they had, in the positions they were given, under orders that often made no sense. Private Severlo, firing his machine gun until it glowed red, did not know he was participating in a futile defense. He knew only that Americans were crossing his beach, and he had orders to stop them. The Panzer Grenadiers of the 21st Division who drove to the sea did not know their penetration was meaningless. They knew only that they had reached their objective. The teenage soldiers of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, dying in Norman hedgerows, believed they were defending their homeland from invasion. The impact of Normandy on German military capability extended far beyond the divisions destroyed in France. The loss of experienced NCOs and junior officers, the backbone of small unit leadership, could not be replaced. Training schools in Germany graduated new officers, but these men lacked the combat experience that had made the Wehrmacht so effective. The new recruits filling out shattered divisions had received abbreviated training, often just weeks instead of months, preparing them for specific defensive positions rather than mobile warfare. The Wehrmacht that emerged from Normandy was a shell of what had entered it, capable of defensive fighting but lacking the operational flexibility that had characterized German armies earlier in the war. The strategic consequences of the Normandy defeat extended beyond the Western Front. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs, demonstrated at Normandy, would be repeated at the Falaise Pocket, in the Ardennes offensive, and finally in the defense of Germany itself. Each time, the result was the same: catastrophic casualties and the destruction of forces that might have been preserved for more effective use. The Normandy campaign established a pattern of German defensive operations that prioritized ideology over military practicality, honor over survival, and obedience to Hitler over professional military judgment. They were, in a sense. But their homeland was already lost. The legacy of D-Day for Germany was the beginning of the end. With Normandy lost, the Allies gained a permanent foothold in Western Europe. They liberated Paris in August. By September, they were on the German border. Hitler's fantasy of throwing the Allies back into the sea died on the beaches of Normandy, and with it died any chance Germany had of avoiding total defeat. The Eastern Front continued to collapse. The strategic bombing campaign intensified. Germany was being crushed between two unstoppable forces, and there was no escape. The Atlantic Wall, that monument to German engineering and slave labor, stands today in ruins along the French coast. bunkers slowly being reclaimed by sand and surf. The guns are gone, sold for scrap, or placed in museums. The mines have been cleared. The beach obstacles have rusted away. The engineering specifications of the Atlantic Wall fortifications reveal the scale of German miscalculation. A typical bunker designed to house a 75mm anti-tank gun required 200 cubic meters of reinforced concrete, steel rebar, and was designed to withstand direct hits from 500-pound bombs. The walls were 2 meters thick. The entrance was protected by a chicane and armored door. Inside, the crew had ammunition storage, sleeping quarters, and an escape tunnel. Building such a structure required hundreds of man-hours of skilled labor and consumed resources that might have built tanks or aircraft. Germany constructed thousands of these fortifications along the Atlantic coast, and on D-Day, the Allies simply bypassed the ones they could not quickly overwhelm. The gun batteries of the Atlantic Wall were perhaps even more impressive and even more useless. The Long-Sur-Mer battery, positioned between Gold and Omaha beaches, mounted 4 150mm naval guns in concrete casemates. Each gun could fire a 90-pound shell over 12 miles, enough to reach any ship in the invasion fleet. The battery had range-finding equipment, ammunition magazines blasted into the cliff, and protection sufficient to withstand naval bombardment. On D-Day, the battery engaged Allied warships for several hours, scoring hits on the cruiser HMS Ajax before being knocked out by return fire from the battleship USS Arkansas. The battery inflicted minimal damage and was overrun by British infantry the following day. Its crew fought bravely and achieved nothing of strategic value. The Merville battery, targeted by British paratroopers on the night before D-Day, illustrates the disconnect between German defensive planning and reality. The battery was believed by Allied intelligence to house 150mm guns that could fire on Sword Beach. In fact, the guns were older 100mm pieces with limited range. The position was protected by barbed wire, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and machine gun posts. The assault by the 9th Parachute Battalion was a desperate affair, with only 150 of the 600 paratroopers reaching the objective due to scattered drops. They attacked anyway, at dawn, with minimal heavy weapons, and overran the position in 20 minutes, discovering that the guns were not the threat that intelligence had claimed. The paratroopers had lost 75 men to eliminate a battery that probably could not have hit Sword Beach in any case. These examples multiplied across the Normandy front illustrate a central truth about the Atlantic Wall. It looked formidable. It consumed vast resources, and it gave German commanders false confidence that they could defeat an invasion at the beaches. But static defenses, no matter how well constructed, are only as effective as the mobile reserves available to counterattack. The Germans had fortifications without maneuver, concrete without flexibility. The Allies had men, ships, planes, and the operational flexibility to land. Wherever the defenses were weakest, the comparison between German and Allied logistics in the Normandy campaign tells the story of the battle more clearly than any tactical analysis. The Americans landed with logistics plans that allocated 66 pounds of supplies per man per day. This included ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, spare parts, and everything else an army needs to function. The Germans, even before the invasion, were rationed to less than half that amount. By July, German ammunition expenditure was restricted to 10 shells per gun per day, while American artillery could fire as much as battalion commanders requested. German tank recovery and repair units could salvage and return to service about 40% of damaged vehicles, an impressive rate given the circumstances. American tank recovery units could repair and return over 70% of damaged vehicles, often within 24 hours. What remains are concrete shells and memories. A reminder that no fortification, no matter how strong, can hold against history itself. The German prisoners taken at Normandy provide a cross-section of what the Wehrmacht had become by 1944. Allied intelligence officers interrogating prisoners found teenagers from the Hitler Youth, middle-aged men drafted from reserved occupations, ethnic Germans conscripted from occupied territories, and a significant number of Osttroppen who surrendered at the first opportunity. The elite SS and paratroop divisions fought to near annihilation, but the static divisions often collapsed when their positions were breached. Some units surrendered en masse. Others fought to the last round and then surrendered. Still others retreated in good order, maintaining discipline even in defeat. One interrogation report describes a 42-year-old battalion commander, a veteran of the First World War and the Eastern Front, captured near Saint-Lay in July. He told his interrogators that he had known the war was lost since Stalingrad, that everyone in the German army knew it, but that there was no option but to continue fighting. To desert was to abandon comrades and betray an oath. To surrender was to invite retaliation against family members in Germany. The Nazi system had created a situation where soldiers fought not for victory, which they knew was impossible, but to avoid something worse. This psychological trap explains how the Wehrmacht continued functioning long after rational calculation suggested collapse. The fate of the German wounded in Normandy was particularly grim. German medical services, already strained by the Eastern Front, struggled to cope with the casualties from Normandy. Field hospitals were bombed by Allied aircraft. Ambulances were strafed on roads. Medical supplies were in short supply. Wounded men who might have been saved in 1940 died of shock or infection in 1944. The evacuation of casualties back to Germany became increasingly difficult as the transportation network collapsed. Some wounded men were simply left in French hospitals when units retreated, becoming prisoners when Allied forces arrived. The aftermath of the Normandy campaign saw the destruction not just of German armies, but of the French countryside they fought in. The Norman towns of Saint-Lay, Caen, Falaise, and dozens of others were reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. Thousands of French civilians died in the crossfire or in bombing raids intended to interdict German reinforcements. The liberation of France, necessary as it was, came at a terrible cost to the French people themselves. The Germans, in retreat, often destroyed infrastructure to delay Allied pursuit, blowing up bridges, mining roads, and burning supplies they could not carry. Normandy in August 1944 was a landscape of devastation. The men who defended Normandy deserved to be remembered not as villains or heroes, but as soldiers who fought for a cause that was lost before the first shot was fired. They were caught in a system that valued obedience over initiative, that centralized control over competence, that believed in destiny over reality. They fought bravely and they lost completely, because bravery alone cannot win wars. D-Day from the German perspective is a story of strategic paralysis, operational confusion, and tactical courage squandered by a regime that had already set Germany on the path to ruin. The soldiers on the beaches did not lose Normandy. Hitler lost it. Rommel and Rundstedt's disagreement lost it, and Germany's inability to match Allied resources lost it. The individual stories of German soldiers who fought at Normandy revealed the human dimension behind a strategic failure. There were men like Franz Gockel, a machine gunner with the 352nd Division at Omaha Beach, who fired until his weapon barrel glowed red and his unit was overrun, then spent the rest of the war in an American POW camp. There were men like Michael Whitman, the tank ace of the 101st Heavy SS Tank Battalion, who destroyed dozens of Allied tanks at Villers-Bocage before being killed in his Tiger tank in August. There were men like General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Air Landing Division, killed by American paratroopers before the sun rose on D-Day. Each man's story was different, but all were caught in a system that guaranteed their sacrifice would be for nothing. The German military tradition emphasized duty, honor, and obedience. These values, in themselves not dishonorable, had been perverted by their application to service of the Nazi regime. German soldiers swore personal oaths to Hitler, not to Germany or the German people. This oath was taken seriously by professional soldiers, many of whom continued fighting long after they understood the war was lost because they felt bound by that oath. The question of individual moral responsibility for serving an evil regime is complex and beyond the scope of military analysis, but it cannot be avoided entirely. The men who defended Normandy were not defending civilization or freedom. They were defending a regime that had committed genocide and plunged Europe into war. Whatever their individual motivations or moral culpability, they were fighting for the wrong side. The men in the bunkers and tanks simply paid the price. If this story gave you a new way to see the war that changed the world, like, share, and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that remade history.